The Influence of Video Games on Behavior and the Mothers Against Video Game Addiction and Violence by Kendall. Video games dominate the entertainment spectrum in American society today. The video game industry is incredibly successful and achieves billions of dollars in revenue each year. Two of the most popular video game purchases are Halo and Call of Duty, both violent first-person shooter-style games. Current and repetitive displays of violence in this society have brought violent video games into the spotlight countless times. The Columbine High School shooting in 1999 was one of the first cases that pointed the finger of blame at video games. Soon after the shooting, it was widely reported that the youths played the violent video game Doom, cementing in the public mind that school shootings and violent video games were invariably linked. Because the violent acts seen across the country, most recently during the Boston Marathon, reflect the violent images of a shooter-style game, the exposure of these images have been a concern to some. One group in particular is the Moms Against Video Game Addiction and Violence, a group that opposes all displays of violence in video games and wants to ban these games from the public. According to their website, the goal of this group is to eliminate possibilities for their children to be harmed by violence, and they believe that not allowing children to be exposed to violent games is the best way to achieve this. They want to educate parents and raise awareness everywhere of the dangers of violent video games. Although many people, including the MAVAV, believe that video games are the cause of violence, it is not that simple, and a variety of studies have shown different results. The MAVAV should establish more in-depth research on the effects of video game violence on individuals and should be aware of better sources to allow them to better establish the true causes of aggression, improve their image, and allow them to prevent further violence. Through analysis of academic and peer-edited articles, more accurate and reliable information can help determine the causes of aggression. Better education on the topic will allow the MAVAV to form a more educated opinion on the causes of aggression. The beliefs of this group are that exposure to violence in video games is the cause of violence in our society. Christopher Ferguson, who has a PhD in clinical psychology and is an assistant professor at Texas A&M, and his colleagues recently performed a study examining the long-term effects of video games on behavior. In the academic and peer-reviewed article, A Longitudinal Test of Video Game Violence Influences on Dating and Aggression, a 3-year longitudinal study of adolescents, Ferguson and the other contributors took several factors of the participants' lives into consideration during this study, including video game exposure, antisocial personality, family attachment, delinquent peers, family violence, and depression. It was concluded that any links between video games and aggression are merely the byproduct of other processes occurring in the life of the child. The belief that video games affect human behavior is a correlational belief, not causational. Correlation does not equal causation, making the MAVAV's statement on their site that video games have led to an epidemic of youth violence not accurate and not reliable. Another study conducted in 2012 showed some different results. Tina Willoughby, a professor of psychology with a PhD in the subject, and Paul J.C. Adachi and Marie Good, who are both candidates for a PhD in psychology at Brock University, wrote the article, A Longitudinal Study of the Association Between Violent Video Game Play and Aggression Amongst Adults. In this article, a study very similar to the one mentioned above is executed. Compared to non-violent video game players, violent video game players showed an increase in aggression in a long-term setting. The authors came to this conclusion, but they did not attribute the increased aggression directly to the violent content of the games. Most non-violent games lack competition and are not fast-paced, whereas according to this article, many violent video games involve competition in the form of a battle with opponent characters, and violent video games also tend to be fast-paced. These qualities of violent video games can affect the individual player and cause increased aggression rather than the exposure to violence. So it is important to note, as stated by Willoughby, that there has been no longitudinal research examining the effect of video game characteristics such as competition and pace of action on aggressive behavior. Given this, the aggression increase in the participants of the study cannot be solely attributed to the violence displayed in the games. This article can show the MAVAV that competition and pace can be factors that cause aggression and violence in youths rather than violent images and concepts. By discovering the true causes of aggression, the MAVAV can better argue their opinion whether or not it differs after more credible research. The Mothers Against Video Game Addiction and Violence website contains many appeals of pathos with the use of strong language and statements. However, they lack credibility, devaluing their overall claim and negatively affecting the group's image. There are many statements with no sources or evidence backing them up. The ones that do provide sources provide links to popular sources like the New Zealand Herald. The few sources they are referencing on the website are not peer-reviewed or academic, providing no ethos for the readers. To establish more credibility and improve their image and overall argument, the MAVAV need to reference and cite scholarly and peer-reviewed material on the site. An example of an effective use of an academic article that would offer support to their claim will be through the article Viewing the World Through Blood-Red-Tinted Glasses, the Hostile Expectation Bias Mediates the Link Between Violent Video Game Exposure and Aggression. This article is written by Brad Bushman, Hassan Youssef, and Laurent Beguet, all of who have a PhD in areas of psychology and have an interest in the subject of aggression and have published other works on this topic in the past. Bushman's study had participants play video games for 20 minutes, then immediately complete a story stem and questionnaire. Upon reading this article, the MAVAV could have used the conclusion that Bushman came to. Bushman concluded that violent game players were more aggressive than were non-violent game players. Although this study was conducted immediately after participants were exposed to violent video games and it does not give any long-term effects, the MAVAV could have used this study to strengthen their credibility, overall improving their view and image. Their overall goal and cause could gain better support or attention if they provided sources such as this scholarly article. Another way the Moms Against Video Game Addiction and Violence can improve their image is through the scrutiny of sources both for and against their opinion that violence is caused by violent games. The article Violent Video Games in the Supreme Court offers ways to analyze all of the different studies and approaches to determining whether or not violence is an outcome from gaming. This article, written by Christopher Ferguson, the psychologist previously referenced, discusses the criteria a study must meet in order to be as accurate as possible, whether that article is agreeing or disagreeing with the claim that violent video games affect human behavior. Ferguson states, "It is important to consider all forms of evidence, as the strengths of one form of evidence may offset the weaknesses of another approach. By learning how to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of a study, the MAVAV can provide the limitations of the articles they cite and further increase their understanding and knowledge of the subject. All of these improvements of ethos will help improve the MAVAV's public image." The MAVAV want to help prevent violence across the world, specifically in their own home for the safety of their own children. Violence will always be prevalent in this society and across the globe, but it can be minimized. Rather than blatantly blaming and boycotting popular violent games, the MAVAV can contribute into further research to help conclude what causes people to act aggressively or violently. In her article discussed above, Tessa Willoughby states, "More research is needed. More research can help conclude more concretely how and if video games affect individuals and what are other causes of increased aggression. Through more research and studies being conducted, the MAVAV can discover concrete causes of aggression and then campaign against that cause, further preventing violence in our society and keeping their children and kids safe everywhere." Another way the Mothers Against Video Game Addiction and Violence can prevent violence is to understand that some video games have positive behavioral outcomes. Playing video games increases cognitive development as well as other qualities of their users. In the article, "New Research Emphasizes Gaming's Positive Impact on Psychological Development," published in Forbes magazine, author Jordan Shapiro discusses the positive effects of video games and references peer-reviewed and scholarly articles. Shapiro states that intrinsic motivation, cognitive effort, and cumulative effort are the criteria for eliciting initiative that many research point to when explaining how and why organized activities promote positive youth development. He explains that video games fulfill these requirements through problem solving, concentration, retaining skills, and also players' abilities to apply them in new and sometimes unfamiliar situations. The MAVAV can use this information to promote games that specifically promote all of these cognitive developments and educate parents about the benefits for their kids. Focusing on games that positively affect youths rather than focusing on the potential negative aspects of violent video games can lead to more beneficial types of games being purchased and played. Increasing awareness of cognitive positive games can potentially minimize the number of parents who resort to buying non-beneficial games. The young men who opened fire at Columbine High School, at the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and in other massacres have this in common. They were video gamers who seemed to be acting out some dark digital fantasy. The Moms Against Video Game Addiction and Violence believe that acts of violence like these are indeed linked to the shooter's exposure to video games. They explicitly state on their website that video games have led to an epidemic of youth violence across the world. With increased aggression and violent behavior, this group believes that their children are at a higher risk for harm. Through better research and access to scholarly and peer-reviewed articles, this group can better understand the true causes of aggression that is so often attributed to gaming. They can also improve their image by improving their credibility, and they can also prevent further violence by funding and supporting more research or promoting games that benefit its users. The MAVAV can help ensure that their goal of keeping children safe is reached through these three things. Although there is no way that violence can be diminished entirely in this society, let alone the world, the MAV can continue to try.